This presentation is an analysis of an essay by Lois S. Bibbings titled Men Refusing to be Violent, Manliness and Military Objection, 1914 to the Present Day, which was featured in the 2012 book edited by Anna Carden-Coyne titled Gender and Conflict Since 1914, published by Palgrave Macmillan and available in the University Library. I chose to explore this particular essay because I was very interested in how the masculinity of conscientious objectors is assessed in comparison to soldiers who were punished for cowardice on the front line. Much is written about masculinity in the First World War, very often from the viewpoint of how soldiers who volunteered or conscripted felt. Anna Carden-Coyne's book attempts to present an interdisciplinary collection of new work which explores conflict in the 20th century through a completely new gendered lens. Lois Bibbings, the author of this particular essay, is a professor of law, gender and history at University of Bristol Law School. Her work focuses on the connection between violence and masculinity. She has had several works published, including a study of male violence in crime in the Victorian period. Bibbings has written several pieces of work focusing on socio-cultural opinions towards objectors. Her work is categorized as a mixture between history, gender studies, law, socio-legal studies, and critical criminology. Men Refusing to be Violent was intended to explore how society viewed the manliness of conscientious objectors during the First World War, and then compare that to how they have been regarded in more recent wars. Throughout her text, Bibbings alludes to a sense that the military, and in particular the soldier, is an embodiment of idealized masculinity. Conscription, she argues, created a state of gender anxiety amongst men, which led to the public shaming of any man who refused to do his duty. Conscientious objectors were seen as deviant and were not given fair representation. Tribunals would often not accept conscientious objectors' reasons due to a pre-existing bias about how men should behave. Eric Dott suffered through exactly this type of prejudice at his tribunal.
They put me through the usual sort of questions that these tribunals did. They had certain routine questions. A favourite one was, what would you do if your sister was threatened with rape by some German soldier or something like that? And I can't quite remember what I answered, but it was to the effect that that had nothing to do with being a CO against the war. The thing was, this was a protest against the war, that the war was wrong.
One of the main questions that Bibbings asks in her text is, if not to fight was seen as unmanly, why was there an exemption put into legislation at all? The conclusion she draws is that the government wanted to be seen as liberal and tolerant in a time when these values were more desirable than ever, but that at the same time it allowed potentially dangerous groups of conscientious objectors to be brought into the open, recorded and ultimately monitored. Despite this, Bibbings states that many objectors were actually praised for their courage in standing up for their beliefs and opposing conscription. She reinforces the compassion that gradually appeared for those belonging to pacifist Christian orders and Quakers who had long been known to oppose violence and the idea of killing. It was very enlightening for me to see accounts of government official documents slandering conscientious objectors. Although I already knew that public opinion towards COs had been that they were not real men, I was shocked to see Bibbings recount the Home Office description of conscientious objectors as feeble in physique, weak of will, unstable of character, and mentally defective. Any conscientious objector who was forced into the army after appealing to a tribunal would be subjected to a form of bullying Bibbings refers to as remasculinizing. This is reinforced by this account from George Dutch, who was punished for refusing to put on his army uniform.
He stripped me of my own clothing and put the uniform down beside me and said, "Now you've got to put it on." I said, "Well, I will not put it on." "All right, you've got to sit there." I sat there for a day or two, and the whole camp was interested. Everybody knew what was going on. So you should come and put it in. Go on, stick it, boy. Stick it if it kills you. Because after a day or two, suddenly my tent was taken up and taken right up on top of the cliff overlooking the sea. This was in November, and it was pretty cold, misty weather. And my uniform put beside me again by the tent pole, just to make things worse than ever. They rolled the tent walls up so that the wind came right into the tent all round, and I could sit there and freeze, which I did. The orders were that no one was to come near me until I dressed and came down. Well, I didn't dress, I didn't go down, and I stayed there, and I'm not quite sure now how long it was, but I think it must have been at least 10 days.
The focus for the final part of this work shifts to an analysis of objectors in the late 20th and early 21st century. Bibbings does not explore the Second World War or Cold War in any detail, other than with a brief explanation of how regulations changed post-1970 to allow British Armed Forces to allow serving members to resign on conscientious objection grounds with no penalty. Bibbings admits that the nature of conscientious objection in the later period means that recording of cases are slim. However, she manages to find and discuss a few cases of men leaving the military due to objection in both the 1991 and 2003 wars in Iraq. What she finds here is that society as a whole is much more aligned to opposing warfare than in the First World War. This means that they are more likely to forgive individuals and even sympathise with them. However, she also finds cases where there is still a stigma of unmanliness attached to people in the armed forces who refuse to fight, and recounts that the remasculinizing form of bullying still exists. One thing that Bibbings alludes to, but does not cover in enough depth, is the fact that conscientious objectors in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have made a conscious decision to join the military, an organisation where there is a realistic expectation of individuals being called to go to war. This is a very different story to fighting as an expectation of manliness, as was the case in the First World War. Bibbings concludes that this is the case that in the later period there is a disinclination on the part of the military to recognise objectors due to the threat they pose to the prestige of the military and to general morale. Bibbings' work was certainly interesting to read. I found it easy to follow, and her explanations were clear and well researched. It certainly echoes other work on attitudes towards conscientious objectors, such as that by Tim Luckhurst in 2016. Her references include many primary sources, accounts of conscientious objectors, trial records and newspaper reports, as well as pieces of legislation and military documents. She references her own previous work a lot, and it is clear that this is an extension of her own research to fill a specific gap in the historiography of conscientious objectors. I am not entirely convinced by one of her statements in the later part of her work, where she claims that the modern military still focuses on masculine values, and the general assumption that men are prone to violence, meaning that a male soldier who refuses to fight is incomprehensible. Bibbings relies heavily on her own previous work, and I feel that she is focused too heavily on her own preconception that men are prone to violence. I wonder what her opinion would be now, even nearly 10 years after this was written, as I feel this dynamic has changed dramatically in the last decade. Although I understand that her focus here is on a particular section of history, I feel her work could be put to the test with a study whether masculine values still exist in the modern military. With women having been given an open field for all roles in the military in the past few years, it will be interesting if there are instances of a reversal of the masculine ideal of a soldier. I also wholeheartedly disagree with a statement she has made about male-perpetrated domestic violence being not treated as a real crime, because, well, in her words, boys will be boys, alluding to another piece of her own previous work. In conclusion, this was an interesting article to read. It gave me an insight into the gender-based bias against conscientious objectors during the First World War, and it definitely made me think about how attitudes towards objection to war have changed up to modern times. I can certainly see this being a useful source for an essay exploring masculinity in the First World War, due to its discussions of how COs were treated. Bibbings is certainly a well-respected academic, and her work is very accessible. Thank you very much for listening, and I certainly hope you enjoyed this presentation. Included in the handout are links to some further reading around this topic, and some more of Lois Bibbings' work.